Hello and welcome back to Spare No Arrows, uncompromised Christian content calling out bad theology and equipping you with biblical truth. My name is Cody Lawrence, and we're going to be talking about how another church leaves Acts 29 because they can't trust them anymore. I'm going to tell you exactly what went down and further pile on the evidence of the collapse of Acts 29. If you want more details on the corruption going on behind the scenes at one of the world's quote-unquote most reputable church planting networks, then check out my previous podcast episodes on it. I have quite a few. And if you're a longtime listener and you like my content, consider helping me keep the show going by subscribing to my Patreon at Spare No Arrows. All right, let's get into it. So, This happened a couple weeks back, and I wanted to go through this Twitter thread where this pastor of this church that recently left Acts 29 lays out all of the details and also wrote a letter to his church with the elders wrote a letter to the church giving more details. It's a public letter kind of calling out Acts 29. His name is Rick White. You can find him on X here. And I wanted to go into detail on this thread. So I'll just get right into it. He says, our church has resigned our membership from the Acts 29 network. It saddens me that it had to come to this. After 18 years of serving and giving, along with my personal investment, it would be fair to ask why. It would also be fair to ask why the public post. Now, incidentally, one thing I read elsewhere was that his church was actually planted out of Matthew Chandler's Village Church, or Matt Chandler, as most people call him. Very interesting if you know Matt Chandler's history. I actually have a lot of podcast episodes on Matt Chandler as well that you can check out. So Rick continues. He says, let me start with the second question. And yes, regardless of my motivations, I know this post might rub some the wrong way. That's fine. Candidly, I did not originally plan to make public remarks, nor did I desire to do so. Let me provide some context. First, in respect to those I have recruited into Acts 29, those I have encouraged to stay in Acts 29, and those to whom I have personally defended Acts 29, I do believe I owe an explanation as to why we are resigning our membership. That's good. Additionally, because I have defended Acts 29, even while it was becoming indefensible, I feel culpable. I owe apologies or repentance to anyone if I owe apologies or repentance to anyone in these matters, please contact me. This is good. Sometimes, stuff like this happens where people are calling out public organizations or whatever, and inevitably a lot of Christians come to the organization's defense, or people within the organization. They say things like, this is a private matter, you're calling us out, that's sinful, whatever. But public sins, I think, require public repentance, and they also require publicly calling them out. And so if there is a public organization that's sinning, then a podcast like mine kind of spreading the word about that organization isn't sinful, but it's exposing darkness, which is a good thing. And so I think Rick White is right on the money here, and he's totally doing the right thing. He possibly committed public sins to multiple people by publicly defending Acts 29, and so he's trying to undo those sins and repent. So he says, going on, second, on behalf of a larger group of Acts 29 pastors, I have attempted to address our concerns personally and privately with Acts 29 leadership over the past year. Now, this was at the very beginning of January, by the way. He posted these January 2nd. I did this at least 3 times, he says, and once in a private forum with other Acts 29 pastors. So in other words, Rick White saying, I have done this privately, and so I'm now doing it publicly. He's going through the right order of events because evidently the stuff he has tried to change and challenge hasn't worked. And so this escalated to the point of him trying to leave, or to him having to leave, and then getting to the point of publicly calling out Acts 29 for the stuff that they've done because they did not respond to his private exhortation to them. He says, I do not believe these good faith concerns were treated with the seriousness they deserved. by Acts 29. In fairness, I'm sure Acts 29's leadership would disagree. Of course they would. Third, it has been my observation that Acts 29 currently tends to give its ear and show deference to larger churches with pastors that have larger platforms. That's my experience. As a pastor who has had influence within Acts 29 under previous Acts 29 leadership administrations, I feel a sense of responsibility towards the mostly small and medium-sized churches that comprise Acts 29. I do not believe they are given a voice. Finally, I believe I'm a credible voice for those who are frustrated. I have personally invested in the work and success of Acts 29 for most of 18 years. I led either the Texas or the South Central region for 12 years. My wife and I helped assess 40 plus church planters. So Rick White has been, and sounds like an integral part of Acts 29 for years. So it's really interesting hearing that someone like this now has a serious problem with Acts 29 and is stepping away. And not just, people who are kind of kept on the fringes of Acts 29 membership, as someone who's deeply involved in the network for over a decade. It's wild. He continues, he says, Rick White goes on, our church has hosted multiple church planting conferences. They call them boot camps. Our church has helped plant 3 Acts 29 churches that have also multiplied. Until our resignation, our church was the longest standing Acts 29 member in the state of Texas. We were, and I was, he says, heavily invested. And this brings me to the original question, why resign from a network you were so committed to? In summary, it is our best assessment that Acts 29 no longer deserves our continued loyalty or trust based on 3 primary areas. Here we go. This is the climax of the adventure. He says, first, these are the 3 problems that he found with Acts 29. First, it is our conviction that the current Acts 29 organizational structure is flawed and susceptible to corruption and compromise. This is something that I have covered in the past. He says, 2, second, Acts 29's poor decision-making and leftward theological drift make member churches increasingly vulnerable by association. This is also something that I've covered in previous episodes if you want more evidence to support Rick White's claims here. And 3, he says, finally, we no longer believe Acts 29 helps us multiply churches. That's fascinating. Something that I spoke with Pastor Chase Davis about in my interview with him. He was the pastor of a church who was forcibly and suddenly removed from Acts 29, basically for asking questions and challenging them very gently within the network about their leftward drift and other issues. He said that we talked about the finances of Acts 29, and he explained to me that actually a very small portion of Acts 29's profits actually go to planting churches. Most of it is basically for vacations that the pastors take and all that, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with pastors taking vacations. But the issue is if you're giving money to a church planting network, and I think he said like 5 or 10% of the money actually goes to planting churches, that's outrageous. They're lying to you. So Rick White continues, he says, in conclusion, our church has been incredibly loyal to Acts 29 through the years. I remain and hope to continue remaining friends and gospel partners with many of Acts 29's staff, leaders, and mostly the pastors of Acts 29 member churches that choose to remain. However, I can no longer personally recommend the Acts 29 network as a good stewardship of one's time, money, and energy. So to rephrase that, what Rick White just says, he says he hopes to maintain being friends with the other pastors in the Acts 29 network. However, he thinks they should leave. He thinks Acts 29 is not a good steward of your time, money, and energy. And if you are participating in something and giving money to an organization that is not a good steward of one's time, money, and energy, then it is the wise choice for you to leave. And so I think that is what Rick is very gently trying to say here. So that's the story. I also want to read in a little more detail something that he wrote from this official letter that he sent to his church and also posted publicly. He said, an abridged version of the letter to our church members with more details is available for anyone who wants to read more. So this isn't a private thing, it's a totally public thing that he wants people to read. So I'm just going to skip, it's not a long letter, and so you can go read this yourself. It's linked to his X profile here. But I wanted to go into detail about these 3 problems that he had with Acts 29, just to give you a little more information about what's going on. He says, first and foremost, it is our conviction that the current Acts 29 organizational structure is flawed and susceptible to corruption and compromise. That's what he said in his post. So here are the more details. Per the current bylaws, Acts 29's board is a self-perpetuating entity, with the current Acts 29 president, who is also the lead employee. By the way, the new president, his name is Brian Howard. The previous president was Matt Chandler. Matt Chandler stepped down from being the president during the whole debacle where he sent inappropriate text messages to a female church member who was not his wife. There was some kind of inappropriate relationship going on there. I've done a couple of podcasts on this in the past if you want more details about that too. This is a rabbit trail that you could go down, Acts 29. A lot of people view Acts 29 as a really reputable church network. The church that I left a couple years ago was a member of Acts 29, and that became increasingly concerning to me the longer I was at the church and the more I learned about this stuff. They defended it, and it was a problem. But the point I was going to make was Matt Chandler, who stepped down from being president, is actually still, he's on the board. He might be the executive board member. That's something I covered in that same previous podcast episode about Acts 29. But Brian Howard is the current president, and he's got some interesting problems with him too. But let's go on. The church letter goes on and says, the current Acts 29 president, who's also the lead employee, who is Brian Howard, serving as a member of the 5-person board to which he reports. So in other words, he's the president, and he's the lead employee, and he reports to himself. So do you see the conflict of interest? Do you see the odd that's not okay. That doesn't fly in most organizations. It says, curiously, Acts 29's president, Brian Howard, they're not calling him out by name. I think they probably should. Brian Howard, I'll call him out, also has 2 family members that work for the network. One is the director of human resources. That's actually his wife. And all 3 at a substantial combined financial cost to the network. And so in other words, Brian Howard, the president, lead employee, who reports to himself on the board, sets people's income and has evidently set his family's income, where 3 of them total work for high up positions in Acts 29, including human resources, and they have exorbitant salaries. Now, the interesting thing is, if a person has a problem with this, typically in an organization, who do they go to? They go to the director of human resources, which happens to be Brian Howard's wife. Wife to the person who's the president of the organization and on the board. So do you think if members of this organization had any issues with this and went to the human resources director, who's Brian Howard's wife, that she would actually be able to get Brian Howard in trouble or have any desire to? Probably not. All 3 at a substantial combined financial cost to the network. Finally, and frustratingly, despite the mandate for member churches to fund the network's budget, it has been our experience that there is no meaningful mechanism for Acts 29 to be responsive to the concerns of church members, kind of like the issue of the human resources thing. It doesn't seem like there's any way for churches to actually have a voice in making the network better or voting, whatever. The Acts 29 organization, according to conversations that I've had in the past with people, is like everything happens behind this curtain. like all of the board makes all the decisions, and there's really no input that the member churches are allowed to have with what goes on with the network. So as the network slowly drifts left, the churches, even the conservative churches who are in the organization, who anymore, I believe, have absolutely no business being in the organization whatsoever because of how corrupt it has become, they can't actually do anything about it, which is even more reason to leave. And it's why Rick White and his church chose to leave, because they have absolutely no power to actually change things. And whenever they do try to share their concerns, nobody listens to them. So secondly, here's more details about his second problem. Acts 29's poor decision-making and leftward theological drift makes member churches increasingly vulnerable, and vulnerable by association. Here's the extra details. It says, during 2020, Acts 29 and several Acts 29 leaders signaled leftward positions on multiple social matters. And then he has footnotes here, by the way, in case you want to go into more details. This one that he's specifically referring to here, it says, the most egregious and public example was when Acts 29 staked an ideological position when it posted some racism and racial reconciliation resources. So coming out totally pro social justice and critical race theory, that's a huge problem in a quote-unquote conservative network. The resources were clearly skewed leftwards. Acts 29 went so far as to recommend Ibram X. Kendi's stamped from the beginning for nearly 4 months before finally removing the resources from the Acts 29 website, no doubt because of the pushback that they got. Ibram X. Kendi, bad dude. If you don't know anything about him, you probably don't want to look him up, but you totally could, and you'll realize how bad of a guy he is. Awful, awful person, like total false social justice gospel kind of guy. And this quote-unquote reputable church planting network promotes his material. Weird. He goes on, and it says, these leftward positions became flashpoints which serve to agitate relational rifts in many churches, including ours. At present, Acts 29 has failed to acknowledge or apologize for any part played in stirring divisions in member churches during 2020. And I personally, not participated, like loosely participated in this myself. Like the fact that my church at the time was a part of the Acts 29 church network, that was upsetting to me. That kind of created some division with my church. They made the awful decision to continue supporting this network that was making these awful decisions. My tithes would go to this organization. And that was a huge problem for me. And so I totally see his point here where it was creating division. He says another example. In September of this year, which is, he's referring to 2023, in September of 2023, Acts 29 posted a poorly conceived video titled Walking with Jesus Among Our LGBTQIA plus Friends. I actually did a video on this as well. So basically all the stuff I've covered is the issues that Rick White has had with the organization too, which is awesome. I mean, it's not awesome that these things are happening, but it's awesome that I've done a decent job at covering this stuff. So let's go on. He says, while I am grateful the video has since been taken down, the video was an embarrassing distraction for several days to anyone associated with Acts 29. That's true. Finally, Acts 29 has failed to speak plainly and decisively on the matter of women preaching in Acts 29 churches. And it happens. It's totally a thing that happens. Instead of making a decisive stand based on our historical position, and by the way, the biblical one, Acts 29 chose to create a task force and survey member churches prior to writing a, quote, letter on complementarianism. While the letter was ultimately unnecessary, it contains much that is commendable, yet lacked decisive clarity. This is a theme here. Acts 29 lacks decisive clarity on theological issues. The irony is that they said last year that they wanted to define the year 2023 with their theological clarity, and they utterly lacked to do that. The only thing that they decisively came down on was how indecisive theologically they all were. More interested in ecumenicism than truth, in other words, which is, kind of the problem plaguing our nation right now. And anybody who doesn't see that doesn't deserve people being a part of their organization, I think. They deserve to collapse and fail, like what we see Acts 29 doing, incidentally. He says, while the letter was ultimately unnecessary, contains much that's commendable but lacked decisive clarity, signaling Acts 29's intent, to continue equivocating on this matter while disregarding and disrespecting its firmly conservative members. So Acts 29, traditionally conservative, it's becoming more and more left. These churches who have been sticking with the organization from the beginning are really concerned by this leftward drift. But want to keep fighting, but they have no way to fight. And Acts 29 continues posting this obviously liberal material. And the sad thing is, I think the leaders of Acts 29 churches know about all these problems, but whenever I personally have tried to have conversations with people who are members of Acts 29 churches, they don't believe me. Like, the stuff I'm saying sounds so outrageous, they think, no way would my church be a part of that. I've never heard about any of this. Yeah, because they don't want you to. Like, your church, if they're a part of the Acts 29 network, they don't want you to hear about this because they don't want to create division in the church. Now, this would be a good kind of division in the church, I think, because it really is a bad decision to stay a part of Acts 29 at this point. But Acts 29 also, they don't want this information to be publicly released to church members. Their focus is training and equipping, quote unquote, equipping with, in a really bad way, their church leaders. So as a church member, if you're not doing kind of deep diving into this kind of thing, you're not going to hear about this stuff. And it's sad because you think like, oh, my conservative church. And another thing is some churches, they just don't do enough research. They think like, oh no, Acts 29 was good 10 years ago, and so it's got to be good now. And they just, they're only kind of loosely connected. They think church planting is valuable, and so they give money to Acts 29. They don't go to any of the boot camps or hear the racial reconciliation lectures. And so they're supporting them kind of ignorantly. Maybe that could be happening. I think that happens in a lot of cases with the SBC, where we see a lot of very similar stuff happening. I think many churches are just ignorant of the goings on in the SBC at this point. But people don't know about this stuff, and so it sounds insane when you hear it for the first time, because it's gone so far left. It sounds outrageous, and it is, but it's reality. This is the real world. So the third issue, going into more detail, that Pastor Rick White has about Acts 29 is this. Finally, we no longer believe Acts 29 helps us multiply churches. Now, this is Acts 29's entire mission. Their goal is that they're a church planting network. That's their purpose for existing. And so if this church planting network doesn't actually plant churches well, they don't deserve to exist, right? So let's see what Rick White has to say. He says, first, it is our conviction that multiplying churches will need to be intentionally disposed towards planting with a generational mindset. We desire to partner with institutions that will be a blessing to our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. We do not believe that Acts 29 is helpful towards these goals. Acts 29 tends to lead by pragmatism and is often captured by the whims of the moment. Second, we believe that multiplying churches needs to be heavily invested in the work of replanting and revitalization in the days ahead. While it is admirable that Acts 29 wants to keep its focus on church planting, we believe this is myopic and will produce diminishing returns as planting churches becomes increasingly difficult in our Western culture. So let me comment on this before going on to the third point he makes. First, it seems like Acts 29, I would assume what he's saying here is that when he says they don't have a generational mindset towards planting churches, it kind of sounds like when they plant churches, they want those churches to be targeting the audience that is most likely to want to come to that kind of church. So like young, hip folks. That's kind of like what my previous Acts 29 church was. It was kind of young, and it was, connected with the seminary, a lot of like 20-somes there. Vast majority of the church members were 20-somes, like 3 or 4 people, maybe over the age of 60, were members of the church. And also, incidentally, my previous Acts 29 church, it was called Emmaus. They prided themselves in being what they called a transient church. So basically, the entire church changed every couple of years because they didn't focus on being committed to the church, or like building up your family where you are or whatever, or because it was associated with the seminary. People literally just went to the church to be there while they were at the seminary, and then graduated and left. And the church didn't seem to have any interest in building a large community of people who are actually in Kansas City outside of the seminary. And so maybe other Acts 29 churches are like that too. That's what I saw in my Acts 29 church experience, and it seems like Rick kind of has the same impression about the network as a whole. They're more interested on being trendy and grabbing the largest amount of people that they possibly can, and they're not really interested in playing the long game. They care about you, sort of, but they don't care about your kids. They don't care about your grandkids, and that's concerning, to say the least. So his third point is Acts 29's top-heavy structure has produced diminishing returns for our church. As the Acts 29's 9 staff and operation has grown, Acts 29 has required member churches to contribute more money, time, and commitment. We do not believe these obligations have been met with substantive added benefits to our church. Finally, while being a member with Acts 29 has previously been helpful for drawing both future planters and members, it is currently rare to receive referrals via our church listing on the Acts 29 website. This is a significant change and speaks to Acts 29's fading reputation as a trusted quote-unquote brand. It's true. In the larger evangelical landscape. Yeah, this is absolutely true. Acts 29 is losing its reputation. People are starting to recognize that it's not a good church network. Like the leftists, they don't want to go to Acts 29 because they still pretend to be conservative. And the conservatives don't want to go to Acts 29 because they're clearly leftist. So it's a network for nobody, and they're not even planting churches. So I hope that was interesting. Like I said, this is a rabbit trail. You can listen to all the previous episodes I have on Acts 29 and Matt Chandler and Brian Howard, for that matter, if you want more details on what's going on behind the scenes at Acts 29. Hopefully, this was educational, edifying. God bless. I'll catch you next time.